one of the big themes during last week was obviously the new gTLD program, as it has been for the past several years, really now. So as you can see here, and this was a slide that was presented last week, which actually probably at this point is outdated because the program is, well, I would say moving fast, but you have to remember in ICANN terms that's relative, but we are moving at a pretty good pace. So now over 500 gTLDs that have been delegated that are operating in the root zone today. You can sort of see the geographical breakdown here, many of them coming out of North America. And when we looked at the application numbers, the majority of them came from North America. So that makes sense. And you see some representation from Europe and Latin America with just a small number coming out of the African region, but really a small number of applications from those regions as well. This is kind of where ICANN stands in the process. If you'll remember way back when, we had 1,930 applications that were submitted. Those over 1,200 have been invited to contracting, and really why that number is significant is because ultimately that's what will end up being entered into the root zone. And so we're really not even halfway through the number of TLDs that ultimately will be delegated. Now, remember, not all of those will be available for registration by the general public and by corporations. There's .brands and other things in there, but really ultimately will be north of that 1,200 number. And so you can see there's still a ways to go in the process. If we look at the next slide here, you can look at the updated timeline, and we've been following this for the last several years. You've seen many different timeline slides. First, it was the application process and the delegation process, and so this is that kind of updated delegation slide. And you can see, as I said, we're over 500 delegated, which is not even halfway there. And you can see really the remaining TLDs will continue to be delegated up into 2017. And so we've got, at least another year, 2 years plus, where we'll see new gTLDs entering into the root zone, becoming available for registration. If we look just at the numbers of domain names that have been registered in these 500 TLDs so far, we're north of 4 million domains. I would probably venture to say we're probably at 4.5 million right now. The interesting thing to note is we're actually coming up on the first anniversary of some of the new gTLDs going live, and so we'll start to get some insight into how these TLDs are performing in the renewal cycle. And so I know a lot of our clients that registered domain names in the sunrise period, where many of the registries had a 2-year minimum. All of the general availability domains were available only for 1-year registration. So as we go through the next several months, I think one of the TLDs has already hit their renewal, which is the Arabic TLD, which was one of the first ones to go. I don't know if that's necessarily representative of what the overall numbers will be. I think when we start to see things like .guru, for example, which was one of the first Donuts TLDs to launch, when we start to see the renewal information come out on those, it'll start to give us some insight as to how these are going to perform in the overall renewal picture going forward. You can see here, these are the top 10 most popular gTLDs registered globally. So you can see .xyz makes up a little over 18% of the total population. And for those of you that aren't aware, .xyz actually partnered with a well-known retail registrar to essentially give away free domains for a year. So that actually will be one that will be very interesting to see what their zone file or their domain list looks like after we hit that free 1-year domain name period. So how many people are willing to now actually pay to renew and keep their .xyz domain name. So interesting to see what this chart looks like in the next 3 months, I think, is when we'll have some good information, insight into that. So contrary to what the sort of global distribution looks like, this is representative of what MarkMonitor clients are registering. So the corporate perspective, and you can see here kind of a vast difference between this and the retail market. So .xyz isn't up here at all. One of the other big ones, which was .club, is not even in the top 10. Things that are more relevant and connected to business, something like a .reviews, a .support. You can see real correlation between that and a business and a corporate entity. So definitely some differences here, but the one thing I will say is that the geographic TLDs, things like .London and .NYC, .Berlin, continue to be performing well, in my opinion, and I actually would have anticipated that. I think you can make an argument that those actually have some of the most relevance to corporations and to end users as well. Actually went out and took the top 100 web property names out there and just did a little comparison between the owner of those names in .com today and the owner of those names in some of the new TLDs and whether or not those names were available. So as I mentioned, .xyz, the largest ones, you can see here, almost 60% of those names are, well, actually more than 60% are not owned by the company. They're either registered and not owned by the actual company, or they're on a collision list, or in some cases available. But you can see, just about 20% of those web property owners actually chose to register their domain in .xyz. And so we have a couple of other examples to through just to kind of show you. So you can see here .club, about that same percentage, 20% on the company owned. They actually had more names on the collision list and names that were available, and almost 50% that are registered to some other than the current owner of that web property. .Berlin, much more available names on here because there is a nexus with .Berlin to have local address information in Berlin, so I imagine that's why we don't see as many of these names taken either by the company or third parties as well. .wang, which was a TLD that launched a couple months back and had a much higher percentage of names that actually were registered by third parties, and you can see a much smaller representation of actual companies that chose to register their name in the .wang TLD. So some of the ongoing new gTLD concerns you can see here, and one thing that I would comment on about this is, the delegation of TLDs, as I mentioned, is coming up on about a year. The application period for TLDs is coming up on about 3 years since that process, and so we're sort of in this kind of parallel track where new TLDs that were applied for in 2012 continue to be delegated. I'll talk about some of the issues that we continue to experience, but at the same time, and I'll talk about this in a moment as well, but at the same time, we are now getting into the next phase of the program where there'll be a number of reviews conducted about the program, the rights mechanisms, and then discussion about the next round of TLD. So there's a lot of different paths that new gTLDs are taking, but we haven't lost focus and lost track of some of the existing issues that we're seeing today. And you can sort of see some of them here, and I'm sure some of you on the phone have experienced these. So where domain names that have been reserved that were never allocated because they were on a collision list are now being released and available to register. In some cases, they're not subject to a sunrise period or claims notification period. So that's been a topic that we have been active in dealing with registries and ICANN on. Another very disturbing subject for us and for our clients as well is what we consider to be predatory pricing for trademark owners, where a registry operator will significantly increase the price of the domain to be registered in the sunrise period, but when that name is available in general registration, it's a fraction of that price. So really, in my opinion, almost holding the trademark holder hostage to pay that high fee in the sunrise period. We had several conversations with free operators about this exact topic. And then, really the focus on ICANN compliance in terms of, what is an actual violation of the registry agreement. There's a lot of discussion about things that are gray areas or not addressed in the contract. And ICANN compliance is not serving this kind of proactive auditing role. They are very reactive in terms of when you go to them with a complaint, with an issue, they will investigate and look at it, but they're not doing a lot of proactive work in that area. And the subject that really is getting, I think, increased focus as we get more TLDs introduced into the root is this notion of universal acceptance. And that really is the ability of applications and other technical applications around the world be accepting of TLDs. And so there are a lot of programs that exist that will fail out an email address if there are more than 3 characters in the TLD. So historically, .com being 3 characters, even when we saw things in the past like .info and .mobi launch ran into this where they were 4 characters, and they were running into a lot of errors, a lot of failures on the application level. There's a concerted effort underway now to do outreach to developers, to technology companies, to ensure that when we're building new applications, we're building them in such a way that they support different TLDs that we haven't historically seen. So, as I mentioned, there's many different tracks going on with the TLD program. One of those that is really kind of just in its infancy at this point are these really several different reviews that will take place tied to the new gTLD program. And the new gTLD program is defined as the 2012 round, if you will. So you can see here there's 8 of them, and ICANN has actually just recently released a couple of the reviews for public comment. So for our clients, really the rights protection mechanism review, the security stability review, really important for us. The competition, consumer choice, and consumer trust review is also one that I think is very important, has a lot of attention by the community, senior executives within ICANN as well. And so you can see, if you will take your mind back to that slide about the delegation, we're going to be delegating TLDs to the point where these reviews are going to be going on in parallel. And so for the next couple of years, we're going to see these parallel tracks going on where you'll have a review going on, you'll be able to provide feedback. The rights protection mechanism, I think, is going to be a very important one to participate in and to watch, while at the same time we'll continue to see TLDs launch. And actually we'll continue to see TLDs where there were multiple applications, so some of the more hotly contested TLD strings will actually be launching and go through the auction process and be launching in several years. So I know that by now you're probably sick hearing about us talk about the new gTLD program. There are days, frankly, where I'm sick of talking about the new gTLD program, but it is going to continue, and it will morph, and there will be opportunities to get your voice heard. Any issues that you've experienced during the program, I would encourage you to pay attention to these reviews, and really to the extent that you can participate and make sure that your voice is heard. So with that, I want to turn things over to Elisa, but not before I, on a personal note, just acknowledge and congratulate Elisa for her election actually as chair of the business constituency. For any of you that are involved in ICANN at all, you understand what a monumental task that is, and just a completely busy week for her, clearly during ICANN, but also during the year as well. So I want to congratulate her and thank her for the work that she does for the community. So with that, I'll turn things over to Elisa.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for congratulating me, and thank you also for taking us through that information. As mentioned, we will be answering questions, and I see that there are a couple in the queue already, but I would encourage you to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the presentation. That said, I want to change gears a little bit and talk to you about what's going on with Whois. This is a topic that will not go away, and it's hard to believe that there is still so much going on and so many changes with Whois. And I want to talk to you about some that are really implementation issues, which are currently being worked on as we speak. And there are a couple that I really want to point out to you. In particular, implementation of thick Whois. Well, you might say, well, what does that even mean? For those of you that don't know, .com currently operates what they call a thick Whois, so common net and jobs as well. They operate what they call a thin Whois rather. And what that means is that the registrar is the one that actually retains all of the ownership information about the domains. And when a registry is a thick registry, it means that the registry is the one who maintains all of the ownership information. And why this is important to brand owners and to our clients is because once VeriSign moves away from the SIN model to the SIG model, they will become the mirror of all this information. And why this is a good thing is it will make obtaining information from a single source for .com and .net names a lot easier. I think we can have greater assurance of availability. We can have greater assurance of information being formatted consistently. And I think this is something that will be very helpful, especially since obviously .com is still king, and that's where a majority of the abuse and infringement is occurring today. So that's something to be on the lookout for. Now, when will that actually happen? As you can imagine, there are many forces at play here that probably are not anxious to make these kinds of switches because it will require work, not only for the registry, but also for the registrars as well. So we continue to monitor this closely, but again, this will be something that I think is very positive for brand owners. Also want to point out here some other activity that's currently going on. For instance, there is work that is going on right now with the registrars. There is a requirement in the new registrar accreditation agreement that there should be with Whois some cross-field validation to say, well, if you've got a zip code of 95120, then the city must be San Jose and the state must be California. And this is work that was specified in the registrar accreditation agreement. It has not, however, yet been implemented. There are individuals that are currently working now to determine whether or not this is possible, how it would be implemented, and so that's something that's going on right now. Again, this is an implementation issue. There are also individuals working on how internationalized registration data should appear in the Whois, and that's work that's going on right now. There are also some updates that are going on with regards to ICANN's Whois site. Many of you may not know that ICANN actually offers a consolidated Whois lab, and it's located at whois.icann.org. They're making some improvements to that. So as you can see, there is quite a bit of work that is going on now with regards to Whois. And again, this is what they would call implementation work, where the policy has already been defined and up to ICANN staff to actually make sure that these things are actually implemented. Alongside this implementation work, there's also a ton of policy work going on with regards to Whois. Stuff with this work that was recently released by this gTLD expert working group, directory services. And essentially, this is a set of recommendations that this expert group came up with, basically sort of redefining how Whois would work. And they came up essentially with a platform that would allow sort of gated access. So if you were from law enforcement or a legitimate brand owner, you could get to all of the Whois information. But if you were an individual and you did not have a specific stated interest, you could maybe just get to some limited piece of the Whois record. This is, again, these were recommendations made by an expert group. The next step in the process is for an issues report, a final issues report to be delivered. From the issues report, though, it then goes into a policy development process. It's not yet clear whether or not this expert working group's report will ultimately go into a policy development process at all, because as you saw from Matt's presentation, that we've got 8 reviews coming up in the next year. So a tremendous amount of work is going to be coming up, starting in the next 6 months or so, taking us through the following year, in fact. So it's not clear whether or not we'll proceed forward with actually making these big radical changes or what exactly will happen, but it's definitely something that we are focused on, and people are sort of working through creating this final issues report, which then could possibly turn into, as I mentioned, a policy development process. That will result in just a policy. One of them is an accreditation program for privacy and proxy service providers, which I think is much needed, and again, I think will be very helpful to brand owners. As brand owners, you know that when you try to get information about domains that are masked through a proxy or privacy service, it can often be very difficult to actually get at the information, to understand who's operating the proxy service or who you're really dealing with. And so this accreditation program will address many of those kinds of issues, will clearly provide an accreditation program for those different providers. And so I think this is something we can look forward to having start in July of 2015. That's when that would be approved by the board and implementation of that work would actually begin. Something else that is currently in process is a working group to do some translation or transliteration of contact data, of Whois data. Again, this is something that's firmly in process, and again, we can look to an approval by the board probably around September of 2015, so in the fall of this year. So something, again, we can be looking towards. The sort of big policy issue, though, is around this Whois review team. This will be the second review team. This is something that is required of ICANN under the existing accountability mechanisms that we have in place, which is also known as the affirmation of commitment. Now, this is a big project that will span many quarters. No formal action by the board, though, related to this particular review team would even take place until mid-2016. Again, you can see there's an incredible amount of policy work that's going on around Whois. Again, this is on top of implementation work that I just showed you. But to off, there's also a whole bunch of technical work that's going on. Now, I don't think that impact our clients per se, but it does have an impact on the overall ICANN community, especially those that are responsible for making these kinds of changes. So these are things that would be required of registries and registrars to make changes to in terms of their technical infrastructure. Incredible amount of work going on related to Whois. Even though it seems like, well, nothing ever much changes with Whois, I think with the privacy proxy services accreditation, that will be a big change. Changes to transliteration and translation of Whois, that will be a good welcome change, I think. A lot to be on the lookout for. So I want to change gears again and talk about the IANA transition and this whole notion that ICANN needs to improve accountability mechanisms given that this transition will be taking place. Now, I can tell you at the ICANN meeting, well, there are many people that were very interested in new gTLDs and talking about, like the privacy proxy services accreditation and talking about changes to the transfer process under the IRTP Part D, we're going to talk about towards the end in the board resolutions. Most of the air in the room was being sucked out by this particular topic. And I want to kind of give you sort of a high-level overview of where we're at and what some of the big issues still are. We've talked about this in past webinars, so I don't want to really belabor it. But just a bit of background. Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, also known as the NTIA, has a contract with the U.S. government to maintain what they call the root zone servers. This is basically, you can think of this as sort of the backbone of the internet, and essentially it helps to drive traffic to different internet registries around the world. So these are servers that are serving up information about where to go when you search for a .com. Well, where does the .com registry actually reside? That information is ultimately coming back to these servers that the U.S. government holds a contract for maintaining. In a year and a half or so, there's been increasing pressure coming from other world governments, feeling that the U.S. government has too much control, and a lot of it had to do with the Snowden revelations. And in action to that, I believe that the U.S. government wanted to provide some distance. And the way that they wanted to show that was they wanted to give up the contract, again, for the technical management of these root zone servers. And so the NTIA announced that they would not be renewing the contract and that they wanted to find some multi-stakeholder body to take over essentially managing these servers. So that's why we're at where we're at. In the press, I think it was widely misreported that the U.S. government was somehow giving up control of the internet. I think that was misreported because, first of all, the U.S. government, has not had control of, or even direct oversight over ICANN for some time. The U.S. government is just one government amongst all others that can participate within the Governmental Advisory Committee, or the GAC, but the U.S. government didn't really have control of the internet. But they did have, again, control for sort of the technical management of these servers. And so, again, that's what the U.S. government wanted to give up control of and wanted to essentially find another group that would be a multi-stakeholder group that could take over this responsibility. Now, again, what are these IANA functions? As I mentioned, it's really sort of the ensuring the security and management of these servers. It also entails updating these servers with new information about new TLDs as they're launched. So as new TLDs get launched, it's the IANA responsibility to add that TLD and information about where that new TLD actually resides. If IANA does not add a new TLD into their database, the registry will not resolve, and you'll not be able to find a domain of a new gTLD, for instance, if it's not added to that root zone server. Same thing for all the ccTLDs. They're responsible essentially for every TLD, adding it into their database and propagating that information out to these authoritative root zone servers. Many would have you believe that, you know, the IANA functions are all just very technical, and that's true. They are technical management of these servers. But they do play sort of a critical role in ensuring that any new gTLD or any existing ccTLD or any new ccTLD is added and can resolve. And so really, for me, the big concern is whoever takes over management of these root zone servers will be completely accountable and will follow the guidance that ICANN gives in terms of especially new gTLDs that a new gTLD should resolve, even if, let's say, a particular government might find a particular TLD, like, let's say, .sexy to be offensive, that it would still be added and that no one government or no one faction would capture this functionality that is now currently being provided through this contract by the U.S. government. So to really address that, the NTIA said that, you know, there had to be these principles employed before they would allow the contract to actually expire. And so the U.S. government is saying that, you know, in order to transition to some other process, that process must support the multi-stakeholder model, that we must continue to have security, stability, and resiliency, that we're maintaining the same SLAs, and that the openness of the internet is still of utmost importance and still occurs. Today, the process is currently working. There is a community working group that is working on recommendations for the IANA transition. We developed a proposal which has many different components. There's this notion of a contract company which would actually hold the rights to the contract for IANA functions. There's notion of a multi-stakeholder review team, that there's also this an appeals board. So there's many different that have been put forth in sort of a draft proposal. In essence, there's really sort of a big discussion going on in terms of who will take over IANA functions and how will it actually work. And that really comes down to, will these IANA functions be managed externally by a third party through a contract company, or will they be managed inside of ICANN, and where there is no actual contract between the contract co and a third party, will all be managed by ICANN. And these are the two big questions. I think for many, they feel that going with sort of an external approach where there is a contract co and a third party providing the IANA functions, many feel that that is sort of a very viable approach, because if something goes wrong with that third party, then ICANN can simply or sever the relationship and look for some other party to do it, whereas if it's embedded within ICANN, it may become more difficult to have that severability. Either case, though, because the U.S. government is no longer the one with the contract, these affirmation of commitments that the U.S. government has with ICANN really is no longer an acceptable accountability mechanism, because the U.S. government no longer has that leverage of having the contracts. So along with this transition, there's this whole notion that we all need to define some new accountability mechanisms, because now we're going to have a new group that's responsible for employing the IANA functions. We figure out, well, what happens, let's say, if ICANN, something very, something terrible happens to ICANN or there's processes which are not, following procedures, or essentially there's another community working group focused on enhancing ICANN's accountability. And one of the things that this group has been very focused on is identifying sort of a series of what they call stress tests. These are sort of worst case scenarios, and they've been grouped here into sort of 5 big categories. And you can see, like, for instance, what would happen if ICANN now becomes insolvent? What would happen next? Or what would happen if ICANN fails to process delegations, like I just said? So what if, ICANN decides, that a particular TLD should not be added by IANA into the root? What happens then? Or what happens if ICANN is essentially captured by a particular stakeholder or government? Sort of worst case scenarios. And the question becomes, well, if these happen, then what? What are the kinds of things would need in order to resolve these different scenarios? So some of the things that are being passed by are things like spilling the board, essentially leasing the board and identifying an entirely new board, or overriding the decision of the board, which is something that we can't do today. So these are, this particular working group, this is separate from the IANA working group. This is the accountability working group. This working group, I think, is making some great strides in determining sort of what the stress tests are. There's still many questions from a legal standpoint in terms of, could we do those things? Could we spill the board? Could we override a board's decision? And the things which are still being worked on. Still quite a bit of work to do. I think the big takeaway here is that these groups, and there's a coordination group as well, the IANA coordination group, these groups are working in concert together. Now, whether or not, we're able to make sort of the September deadline, that's when the contract will expire, remains to be seen. My feeling is right now that the CIA will not be able to walk away from the contract in December when it expires, that they'll need to have an extension so that this work can be completed. I can also tell you that this particular issue, the transition of the IANA functions, has now become very politicized within the United States. And there's a desire to try to complete this work of the transition before, basically before this particular expires, so that when the new administration comes in, that this has already been resolved. So many things to still be on the lookout for. But again, I think the big takeaway is, we're working on it. It's a big focus for ICANN right now. A lot of folks who would normally be working on other policy issues are now really focused on this particular area. So definitely more to come. Now, about the GAC. As many of you know, the GAC is the Governmental Advisory Committee. This is really just one stakeholder among many at ICANN, but are a very powerful one and very vocal one. And at the end of every ICANN meeting, the GAC will release what they call their communique. So the GAC, has meetings all throughout the week. They meet with different groups. They meet with the board. They meet with supporting organization. They meet with others across the community. But at the end, and they have their own meetings with just themselves. But at the end of the week, they always come out with what's called their communique. And this is essentially a description of what they've been working on, as well as they will give their formal advice with a B. And advice is generally getting the board what the GAC wants. And there is a presumption the board will respond affirmatively and will be supportive and will do their best to address this advice and meet sort of the acts of the GAC. So what did the GAC say? Well, GAC definitely had some pretty firm advice related to these highly regulated strings. So one of the things that the GAC has been talking about for the last number of meetings is advice around what they call the highly regulated strings, single registrant strings, and are very concerned about, not in particular with these highly regulated strings, that there is a vetting and and verification of registrants. So let's give you an example. In TLDs like .pharmacy and .bank, which are planning on having launches very soon, there's the proper validation and verification. Those TLDs do have those kinds of requirements for their registrants. Now, the GAC had identified a whole series of highly regulated strings. There were 39 of them. Some of those have already been delegated and are already in the route and already available for registration. The GAC asked there be special commitments made by those highly regulated strings. Well, that really didn't happen. So now we've got some that on their own are agreeing to do those kinds of verification and validation, like bank and pharmacy, but we've got others that may not be doing that. So GAC has now asked that basically the board identify those TLDs will have those kinds of protections and sort of hold them out as best practices for others. And then for those that haven't, they're asking that the new TLD program committee basically figure out a way to make those others adopt these practices. Now, I think this is a very difficult situation because the registries that have already been delegated, they've already signed their contract, and they're under, in my opinion, no obligation to make any changes. So it will be very interesting to see how and if ICANN responds to that particular piece of GAC advice. They also asked for some special consideration when the GAC makes a complaint based on any of these sort of public interest commitments, that they're given some fast track so that they can work with contract compliance to have their issues heard probably in a more expedient kind of manner. Now, they also, another big topic at the ICANN meeting was around these two-letter country codes. Many brands are very interested, obviously, in being able to have the two-letter country codes delegated because they want to use them as a way to provide localized content or local language support in support of the .brand TLDs. Now, the only ones, though, that would like to have these two-letter country codes, the generic registries would like to have them as well. GAC has asked for, basically, is a notification system so that when any of the registries make a request to have the two-letter country codes allowed, that they would receive notification that the relevant governments that would be impacted would receive a notification so that they're informed that they have at least 60 days to respond, and for any that have already made requests, that the period be extended by 60 days. And, you know, GAC members who will agree to always approve a request for a two-letter country code, that list be published. And so the GAC is asking the ICANN board and the new gTLD program committee basically to facilitate this process. They've also asked that country and territory names that the ICANN board should develop a database, again, will identify whether or not, you know, a government would always agree to allow that or whether they would not. And again, it would provide information to the requester in terms of, you know, whether this is something they're going to have to work directly with a particular country to get a special approval. Given GAC said this to the board, especially with regards to the first request, essentially decided that, yes, they would definitely process so that when two-letter country codes are requested, that the relevant governments would be notified and that they will extend comment period to 60 days, and they will implement a comment period going forward, which would be 60 days. So you can see right there, this is an instance where the board directly, you know, heard what the GAC is asking for, and immediately they responded in the affirmative by saying yes, that they would do these things and they would comply. Now, that's not, you know, the gist of what the board does, though, is not around sort of coming up and responding to things as they come up. Typically, the board is there to provide their consent of policies which have been developed through the policy development process. And so in their consent agenda, there were a number of other things that the board actually approved, and they are things like, you know, delegating a TLD representing Belarus in the Cyrillic script, the removal of .tp because it has been since replaced. They approved policy related to this inter-registrar transfer policy, which provides some great improvements to the entire transfer process. There was a 4-part policy. The last part of that policy, the ICANN board approved it. Again, the board is not there to say, oh, we should, do it this way or do it that way. They are there to look at the policy that has been through the policy development process and then to either approve or reject that policy. And then they also made recommendations to move forward with the affirmation of commitments review for this consumer competition, trust, and choice, which was one of the reviews that Matt actually mentioned as he was going through the timing for all of the reviews that are coming up within the next year and a half. So information I presented, so I can see again there are some more questions. I would encourage you to ask those questions, type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. Before we turn it over to questions, though, I do want to encourage you to consider becoming more involved. Now, ICANN, I think, has done an incredible job of disseminating information, and you can see all of the different ways in which information is being directly disseminated by ICANN. But also encourage you to perhaps consider joining a constituency. As mentioned, I am the chair of the business constituency, and the business constituency is really the voice of business users on the internet. And the business constituency is focused on 3 primary areas. One, we're very interested in ensuring that the internet is a safe place for businesses and their consumers, and that there's a level of trust that consumers can get because they know the internet is a safe place to conduct business. We are concerned with ensuring that there is access to registries and registrars and that there is a competitive supply of them. And finally, and probably this is sort of overarching approach that we have, is that we want to ensure the internet is a safe, secure, and reliable place. And so we have a very overarching view in terms of we're concerned with things related to brand protection, we're concerned from a technical perspective, we're concerned in all ways in terms of what businesses need for the internet to work properly with regards to naming and numbering. Intellectual property constituency, we actually also participate there as well, but their focus is much more focused on intellectual property concerns. So for instance, they're not so concerned with issues around technical security or infrastructure per se, but we have many clients that also participate there as well. There's another group that I think has done incredible work, and I would consider folks to think about joining if you are currently a .brand registry or you're considering applying in the next round, and that is the brand registry group. Now, this is not a formal group of ICANN, but they've been participating at ICANN, and I think they've done some incredible work, in particular getting the specification 13 added to the registry agreement, which gives special rights to the .brand registries. So there are some different ways to participate, and if you have any questions about participating in any of these, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. So I am actually going to open it up for Q&A, and I can see that we have a number of questions already. We'll start off with the first one from Denver, and the question is, do you have any insights if the new registered domains against new gTLDs, the 4.4 million of them, are actually being used, or are they mostly registered by corporations for defensive purposes?
It's a very good question, and I don't off the top of my head have hard and fast statistics. I think Elisa might have some, but just from the interactions and the things that I've seen in our clients, the vast majority of them are defensive in nature. I know that there are some. I have seen just in my personal life, I've seen some new gTLDs used in advertising, but by and large, what our clients are registering them for is for defensive purposes.
So I do have one statistic, and that is, based on some information from gtLDstats.com. They're showing that almost 66% of the names that are registered are pointing to parked pages. So, what you can take from that is, the majority of them are not being used. Now, the other 35%, are they being used, or they're just not pointing anywhere? We don't know, but as Matt mentioned, for our clients, only think of a few cases where our clients are actually actively using them.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Let's see, the next question, which is from Keith, and the question is, can you explain how reserved names are exempt from the Sunrise registration period? Is this compliant with the applicant guidebook?
Well, no, the applicant guidebook really specifically address how names would be, the process by which names would be allocated specifically. So I term it a gray area. I think a number of registries have done what I would consider the right thing, which is to allow them to be reserved by trademark holders. But it's definitely an issue that I think there continues to be conversation about, and one that doesn't have any clear contractual obligation as far as I can tell.
Say that I mean, it's definitely not in the spirit of a Sunrise period.
Agreed.
You know, the idea was that if you're the brand owner, well, you get first rights to register it, and when it's being held back and not available during the Sunrise period, and then comes off the reserved names list at some time in the future, that's not in the spirit of what ICANN had intended. No. But as Matt said, this was not spelled out into the guidebook, and it's something that people are starting to talk about. Very frustrating. Yeah,
and I think that's, again, I would just reiterate that is definitely an area that we'll want to focus on when we go through the rights protection mechanisms review, to make sure that whenever there is any sort of release of domain names, whether they be reserved, collision, however it may be, that they go through some required Sunrise process.
Here's another question from Denver, and it's around Whois. So it says, for Whois, do you know if there will be registrant information validation? Whois is one that is being abused by domain traffickers and brand infringers.
So the requirement right now for those registrars on the latest registrar accreditation agreement, which is the 2013 RAA, the requirement is either email or telephone validation. So a new registrant registering a domain name or changing ownership of a domain name, and those of you that manage domain portfolios are familiar with this, you either respond to an email or respond to a phone message. Lisa touched on the sort of next step requirement is this notion of cross-field validation, which will be the address provided by the registrant exists in that city, in that state, in that postal code. Obviously, doing that on a global scale is extremely problematic. Doing it in North America is one thing, but doing it in other parts of the world, and remember that the internet is supposed to be, an open place to get on. When you introduce a requirement like that, it definitely gets tricky. So that's why I think seeing that requirement get much more thought out, much more work developed to it. But now that telephone email requirement does exist, again, for those registrars on the current RAA.
Here's another question. How enforce the related new Whois policies? They currently do not do a good job in policing and enforcing Whois complaints.
Well, I guess it's all in your perspective, quite frankly. I remember a time when there really was no ICANN compliance and enforcement. And so, I think if you look back, going back several years, ICANN compliance has taken steps. They have suspended and ultimately accredited registrars that have been in violation of the RAA. And that stuff comes directly from filing Whois complaints through the ICANN system. And I know that, because there's a lack of understanding, I think, of what the requirement is and what the obligation on the registrar is. But trust me, when the registrar is not living up to their contractual obligation, ICANN does take the process and the required steps. They've deaccredited a number of registrars. I think, quite frankly, the frustration lies in the fact that the requirements aren't necessarily as stringent as people would like them to be. And I certainly appreciate that. But we see both sides of it. We see from a brand holder's perspective, so we follow Whois data complaints with ICANN on behalf of brand holders, but frankly, we're also an ICANN accredited registrar. And so we get the complaints, and I know exactly what we have to provide back to ICANN and what the consequences are if we don't provide that. So I will give a little bit of credit to ICANN compliance. They've definitely made strides and have gotten more active. Again, it's not that proactive monitoring that we talk about.
Again, you to please ask questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer them. I see another one up here, which is, in terms of predatory pricing for trademark holders, how widespread is this amongst registries? What can be done to discourage this?
I wouldn't necessarily call it widespread. I mean, generally where we see it is, new entrants into the marketplace, folks that aren't necessarily as familiar with the sort of market dynamics and the best practices, if you will. And I think, again, because there is nothing specifically that ICANN addresses in terms of pricing, it's definitely tricky. What we try to do and what we try to do, when we were actively participating in ICANN, is have those conversations with those registries and frankly leverage our clients along with us and say, listen, and we're happy to do that with our clients present and say, this is not, we believe, like Elisa said, this is not in the spirit of the program. Outside of the ICANN atmosphere, there still is an entire legal system that exists out there that, ultimately someone could avail themselves of. And so, had conversations with ICANN. I think for some of these new folks, once they sort of understand it and you sort of spell out for them of why it's problematic, I like to think positively that we'll sort of not see that going forward, but it's really just a communication and a leverage policy, process that we go through with folks.
Also say that, going at the registries and letting them know, and frankly, this is what we do, that, this is, our clients are having a big issue with this, and I don't want to say shaming them into, reconsidering their pricing, but that has sometimes worked. And sometimes we've brought to them, particular names been held out as premium names to say, look, you are clearly taking advantage of this, 3-letter acronym, or I understand that is a generic word, but that's also the mark of a very famous brand that has something to do with the TLD itself. And so sometimes, having us go back to registry can also, it doesn't fix the systemic problem that we're seeing, but sometimes we can get a resolution on a particular domain.
Yep, will definitely be lessons learned and things that we look to improve upon in the next new gTLD round.
A couple more questions, and I think a couple more minutes. A quick question: what will happen if the IANA transition does not occur by September 2015? Real quickly, if it doesn't or it can't because the committee has not, provided a proposal which is acceptable, that contract can be renewed by IANA. So that's probably what we're looking at. Now, whether that's a 6-month extension or a 2-year extension is unclear, but NIA has been pretty clear that if they need to do an extension, that's what they'll do. Another quick question, how do you join the business constituency and what is the cost for membership? So it's a very short membership form. It's available on the business constituency website, which is const.org, and I believe the cost for a 1-year membership for a multinational organization is 1,500 euros per year. Let's see, any other questions? Okay, we have one here. Have any .brand TLDs started to actually use their newly acquired registry?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There was a Chinese .brand applicant that actually switched over and was forwarding their .com site to their .brand site for a period of time, actually returning really good results in Google searches. They have since reverted and changed course and not actively using it in that manner anymore. No one quite knows why that's the case, but that held out as the sort of biggest .brand to be using it. There are other .brands that have live content up on their websites, and they do actively use it for, I would say, specific kind of targeted reasons. but there isn't any real broad effort to, again, rebrand or outside that one in China, which is not actively doing that today. As we see more brands launch in the coming months and years, we'll see that shift and change as we go.
All right, we've pretty much covered all of our questions, and I think we're at time. So I want to thank Matt for joining me today, and I want to turn it over to Anya for a couple of closing comments, but I want to thank, personally, I would like to thank you for joining us, and we always appreciate time you spend with us, and invite you to reach out to us personally, any questions that you might have that were you don't want to ask in front of a large group, or you want to have personal conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out directly to either Matt or I. That, over to you, Anya.
So great. Thank you, Matt and Elisa, for such a great overview today. And I would like to also thank our audience for your participation. As a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation recording and also the slides. So for additional information regarding MarkMonitor solutions, services, and complementary educational events, please feel free to contact us by email, phone, or by visiting our website. That concludes today's presentation. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a good day, everyone.